All right, we can get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome to MAIC's third webinar of our monthly webinar series. Today, we're pleased to welcome Peter Rahn and Casey Balin of Atlantic Sea Farms, who are going to be telling us about their recent farmer-to-farmer exchange with seaweed companies in Norway and Iceland. So Atlantic Sea Farm started in 2009 and was the first commercially viable seaweed farm in the US. The Atlantic Sea Farms team is made up of scientists, economists, product developers, marketing strategists, food safety and sales professionals, and chefs. Peter is the Director of Quality and Food Innovation, and Casey is the Continuous Improvement and Sustainability Manager. So before we start, I want to just remind everyone that if you have any questions at any time during today's talk, just use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. So you can type in your question and we'll be monitoring and getting those questions to Peter and Casey as we go. All right, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Can everyone see the screen and the presentation okay? Is that? Yeah, can people see the presentation? Okay. So yeah, first I want to thank the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center for the grant to send us on this trip. It was extremely valuable. We had a great time, learned a lot of information, made a lot of really wonderful connections, all of which we're going to share with you now. But yeah, again, just wanted to thank the MAIC. A little bit about Atlantic Sea Farms. We're a mission-based company. Our mission is to work with partner farmers along the coast of Maine to mitigate, to diversify their incomes in the face of climate change. We provide them with seeds for free and technical information and support on kelp farms and growing seaweed, and then we guarantee to buy the seaweed back from them, and then we grow the market and produce products out of the seaweed, and so we can continue to grow our mission and get more farmers in the water and diversify more incomes along the coast of Maine. A little bit about where we traveled. The wonderful thing about Scandinavia is it's all pretty close together, so it was easy for us to hit up a lot of locations. I made a stop in Iceland. I went to a few places in Norway. I also went over to Sweden and Lithuania. And then Casey, if you want to share a little bit about where you traveled as well.
There we go. Excited to hear and share a little bit about my travels as well. So I did kind of a follow-up trip to Pete. When we started researching this trip, we realized that there was so much going on over there that we couldn't really fit everything into 1 week or into one trip. So we divided and conquered. And so I spent a bunch of time in Norway as well. And then I made my way over to the Netherlands to visit a couple of companies there.
And these are a few of the companies and connections that we made. We, like I mentioned, with everything being so close together, and as we'll talk about, everyone in Scandinavia is really collaborative. So we were able to really make the most of our time there and meet with just a large group of people, which was really fantastic. Types of places and where we visited. We both went to a lot of different farm sites. A lot of processing facilities. We visited hatcheries, equipment manufacturers, people that were specializing, companies that were specializing in building production equipment and processing equipment and harvesting equipment for the seaweed industry. And some of those companies are newer and growing out of the increased demand for seaweed, which is very interesting. And then a lot of co-working spaces and incubators and universities. Yeah, so with the close proximity geographically, it's really easy to visit to all these places. And one thing that really stood out and made this trip helped make the trip really beneficial is in Norway and Scandinavia, they're very, very collaborative and into information sharing. So there's just a lot of co-working spaces and incubator spaces. in a lot of different parts of the country. And there are a few spaces where there's multiple seaweed companies that are in the same incubator type co-working spaces, and they freely share ideas and information. Similarities. So there's a lot of similarities we found between seaweed farming and harvesting and processing in Scandinavia and in the United States. A lot of it is based on the working waterfront and the fisheries. The equipment is often shared. The boats and ships and vessels are shared from the fisheries and some of the seaweed harvesters. They also use some processing equipment, shared processing equipment outside of and when they're in the off season. So there's some seafood processing facilities that are in the off season during the kelp harvest in Norway. So they share that equipment. And the coastal populations both are fairly small populations. Maine is around 1.3 million, and Norway is 5.4 million for the entire country. And most of those populations are along the coast or in primarily one larger city that is also near the coast. And then the growing practices, the line grown kelp and seaweed, and the way the farms are sited and situated, a lot of that is very similar to the way that we do things in Maine and the United States. They're also working on strain selection for a lot of different reasons to help improve future crop yields and things like that. And also seaweed cultivation. A lot of people are working on the same types of new products. So, ulva and dulse in particular, and other types of kelp and seaweed.
Pete, I was just going to add one more thing on the similarity.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting to call out was it was really exciting to see just the general excitement for where this industry is going over there. I mean, the fact that we were able to meet with so many people in such a short amount of time, and the amount of work and the amount of companies that are working on these solutions, I think that excitement and that energy mirrors a lot of the stuff that we've seen in the States. And it's really refreshing. Sometimes we get caught up in our own bubbles here in Maine or in the States on the progress that we're making here. And it was really refreshing to see just that level of excitement, that level of investment into an industry that, similar to us here in the States. I think a lot of folks there see the potential for what it could be in 5 to 10 years when we figure a lot of these problems out. But, they were also coming up with some very similar problems to what we had, as Pete mentioned. Yeah. And then I think some of the differences, this was also very fascinating. And I think maybe one of the biggest and most stark differences is how they're tapping into the local knowledge and resources that they have accessible to them in Norway, similar in a way to we are in Maine. But the biggest thing that Pete and I think kept coming back to is their boats are huge. Mm-hmm. And so they're renting these big ships that are used for, could be used on oil from oil companies or from salmon companies or other fishing companies. And they will rent those and rig them up to process seaweed on board and harvest seaweed at a large scale. So similar to how here in Maine, we're using lobster boats, and a lot of the technology and experience that they have these huge boats that they are using to do their seaweed harvest. And so that was a very big difference on just, the implications on that, on how they set up their farm structure to be able to harvest onto these big boats, and then how they do their processing, and some of, the advantages and disadvantages of processing right on the water and having a stabilized product once that boat hits land. So I think there could be a whole presentation on that alone, but I think that there were maybe less points that we found to collaborate or learn from there, because the way that we're going about growing the industries in the two countries is a bit different. Not to say that there aren't learnings. Season was also fascinating. So Pete and I, happened to choose to visit in like the darkest time of the year. It seemed like it got light at like 8:30 or 9:30 in the morning, and then it got dark again at 3:30 in the afternoon. And along with that, just affecting, how it just affects how much daylight there is and how much seaweed can grow and how it grows over the winter. And so a lot of folks seem to be putting their farms, building their farms so they can adjust the height of the farm in the water. And so, this time of year, the daylight stretches a lot longer. And so they have to move their farm down to adjust the amount of sunlight that's getting to the farm. And all of that, a proper kelp scientist could probably talk you through how that would actually work. But it was fascinating to see how the seasons and where they are, positioned geographically affects how they grow seaweed, how they just how they design their farms. And then this technology piece was really interesting, which we hinted into a bit more, but I think there's a tendency in a good way to really try to engineer and design processing equipment, harvesting equipment, farming equipment to do the job. And I think that there were cases where we found that some things were possibly over-engineered. There's a lot of money, which I'll talk about in the next slide, to do some of this R&D. But there's some things that we do here in Maine. We're like, we got people, we got lobster boats, we got equipment, and we're able to go out and harvest, the same amount or more kelp in a day. And so there's things that it just seemed that the technology was maybe outpaced where the industry is right now. But I do think that type of innovation and thinking on a larger scale is an important part for the Western Hemisphere as we continue to develop this market. And I'm sure there'll be some really great pieces of equipment that come out of that. And then funding is very different in accessibility to, capital and money. And Pete, we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, I think I'll also add, the difference in the farms. They do a lot of much larger farms that are offshore, a little farther offshore than what we typically do here in Maine. And then the interesting thing to me on the seasons and the difference in the seasons, it really shortens their harvest time because they have a shorter period of time where they're getting that light, and then it grows really fast the kelp grows really fast in a short period of time. But then once it's mature and ready to harvest, they have a short period of time before the water gets too warm. So same time period, but a much shorter harvesting period.
And then, on funding, I mean, this probably just scratches the surface on some of the funding and economic and social differences, but there was a lot of EU money and a lot of money from the Norway government as well to help fund some of the R&D, some of the development of this technology. A lot of the mechanization, a lot of equipment was coming out of different government grants and EU grants. And I think that comes from a place of the EU and Norway recognizing the potential for this industry and trying to kind of jumpstart it by putting money into the research and development. And, we also noticed that there was just a lot of oil and salmon money. Folks that had made it big or saw other people make it big in oil and salmon see an opportunity here with kelp. One company that Pete and I both actually visited with is one of the biggest salmon companies over there, and they've started their own division in the past couple of years doing kelp farming. And so the access that they have to capital to run that kelp farm and to do R&D on products, R&D on seed selection, etc., is pretty extensive given their resources. And then there's some other economic and social differences that were interesting, that there's just the fact that there's more companies in this, country with only about 5 million people. We were able to meet with so many different companies, and there's a lot of folks that are focusing on this, and there definitely did feel like there's this kind of rush to market or rush to grow, which maybe feels similar to here, but to have so many more companies doing it and doing it in a more variety of ways. And then their market largely is to the EU. They're not selling a lot of that product in Norway. And so there's other limitations that they have. Iodine is a big issue, and that they have to really work on in order to access the EU market. And then another one that just felt interesting is that there's a lot of there's more social acceptance, I felt like, of deer in the water. Aquaculture is very established there with all the salmon fishing industry. And that wasn't something that I heard about from anyone I met with about concerns about having deer in the water, which I'm sure has implications on people's ability to scale and grow their projects. Was there anything you wanted to add on this one?
No, that's great. I'll go to the next slide. So how kelp is used in Scandinavia? Again, very similar to the US. A lot of products for human consumption, a growing, I should say, animal feed market, and interest to work on solutions for kelp for the animal feed market. Fertilizer, especially with wild harvest product, but fertilizers is a market over there. And then also new materials like bioplastics. People are starting to get into that more. A lot of the food products are sold through value added products, similarly to here. There's less direct to consumer sale of raw or blanched kelp, but a lot of creative and different ways to put it into everyday food items. And as Casey mentioned, they have a lot of challenges with the iodine regulations in the European Union and in Germany in particular, which really limits what they can use kelp for and how they can get it into different food items. I know one of the companies I was talking to sells a center of plate product with seaweed in it, but they can only put, it was like 0.5% or 1% seaweed in the product in order to sell it in Germany, which was their larger market. So a lot of similarities in products and how it's used, but the regulations are different and can be challenging in different ways. There's projects on animal feed solutions. And then one thing that was interesting to me on the product development side, a lot of the food items, in particular, the human consumption products, are business to business and sold as ingredients. And then those larger food companies do a lot of the product development, and there's less products out there at scale and product development done directly from the producers at this point. And a lot of them that I talked to are working on products and new products, but the product development as of the time of my visit was primarily done through the ingredient companies that the kelp was and seaweed was sold to.
So a little bit more about about drying and some of our lessons learned and challenges from our time over there. I think the biggest high level takeaway was that there's a huge lack of kelp specific drying technology. There's a lot of other drying technology out there, but the carryover to get into kelp is a lot more complicated. And some of those challenges that we talked about with a lot of folks in Norway and other countries was the moisture content of the seaweed, the cell structure, and how it can be more complex to get the water out, the salt content, the iodine content, and the shelf life of the product. And so a lot of the typical pieces of technology that maybe would work to dry other agricultural products had had other challenges. Another thing that came up quite a bit was the energy costs, which are pretty high in certain parts of Scandinavia and the EU. In Pete's visit to Iceland, he came across a dryer that uses geothermal energy, which was a huge solution. If only we had geothermal abilities in Maine at that scale that we could tap into. But I think that was a really interesting thing, to get this product dried to a price point where you can sell to a large market. You have to look at all of your costs going in, and energy cost was one that was really concerning a lot of people, of how do you do this at scale at low energy cost. And then just the market and price point, finding a market for dried seaweed. It seems like there's a couple big companies, as Pete mentioned, that are using a small amount of dried kelp matter in their product, but to tap into the EU market with a dried shelf stable product definitely has its challenges.
Yeah. I think Right, exactly. I think people are trying to figure out the technology and they're trying to produce the product, but they don't know what to do with it yet.
And this photo here is from Seraputis, which is one of the companies that Pete visited with, and they're a mock-up of their kelp dryer. I don't remember if they've built this machine or not, but what we found was that, you know, there's designs and ideas to build some of this machinery out, but that takes a little while to go through all the R&D to get it to a point where it's, you know, ready to be commercialized at a higher scale and at a higher throughput. And it's just going to take time to do that trial and error to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, the solution is that the solution or the conclusion that there is no clear-cut solution. People are also looking at other hybrid solutions. So maybe doing a combination of solar drying and then mechanical drying, or the reuse of waste heat. So some folks were looking to capture waste heat off data center technologies, reuse that free heat to then dry their kelp down. And there's a lot of different drying technologies that I think people are trying and tossing around: hot air dryers, rotary drum dryers, processing techniques for water removal and to get that water content lower before going into the dryer, and people talking about 2-step, 3-step, 4-step processes to get it so that the dry time is shorter, the dry time is cheaper when you're using that high energy intensive part of the process. And like I mentioned, I guess, yeah, there's some manufacturers that are starting to manufacture these kelp dryers, but they're just in the very early stages. And I think it's great to see that some companies are working on kelp specific dryers that are taking into account how unique kelp is as an agricultural product to dry, but there's still a lot of testing to be done. The throughput's a huge question. I mean, you can build a dryer, but what's the throughput of it? Does it work for whichever scale business? And for the purposes of our business, what we were looking for was a pretty high throughput, and some of the drying technology or drying options we came across just were great solutions, weren't going to meet the needs and the throughputs that our business needed. So I think that's an interesting point as the technology evolves, how can it be scaled up in a cost efficient and energy efficient, labor efficient way to meet those needs. Anything else to add on to that, Pete?
No, I think you got it. Yeah, it was very interesting that it seems like everyone in the U.S. and Scandinavia were trying to figure out the same things at different scales with different challenges, but there isn't a clear-cut solution.
Yeah, we're all kind of moving through the water at the same pace, trying to get to the same destination. Yeah. And it's by the prospect of figuring it out, because I think it unlocks a lot of potential for the market as a whole.
Yeah, that the dryer that I looked at in Iceland was about the size of a barn. It's probably the largest piece of food manufacturing equipment I've ever seen, and it cost them nothing to run it because they get free geothermal out of the ground. But if you were to power it with electricity or gas, it would just be astronomical. So really interesting to see all the different solutions and challenges that people face trying to troubleshoot some of these kelp processing solutions.
Actually, we just had a question pop up about drying, and this might be a good time to ask it. One of our participants is wondering, how is most of the kelp currently being stabilized before sale, especially sale B2B? So basically, if they're not drying all of it, or are they?
Yeah, and primarily, they're not drying all of it. A lot of it in Norway that I saw anyways was blanched or frozen, or blanched and frozen. I think the interesting thing, and one of the interesting differences was around iodine. They blanch primarily for iodine removal, and not necessarily as a kill step. So in the U.S., a lot of us Atlantic Sea Farms, especially, we blanch as a kill step and a food safety step. but they blanch primarily for iodine removal. So there's a lot of stabilization. A lot of it is blanching and freezing, and then drying if it's not frozen.
Yeah, one of the companies that Pete visited with, they had like a small commercial dryer that they were using, had some challenges with as well, and they were also hanging kelp up in a greenhouse to air dry.
Yeah.
Another company wouldn't really share how they dried their material. So we didn't get much out of them on that. And then others were just using small scale dryers. One was a rotary drum dryer that for one processor didn't work. For another processor, they were able to use the rotary drum dryer. They had lower electricity costs and lower throughput that they needed. But a lot of it, some of it was just like really lower throughput, like drying 1,000 pounds in a day was what some of these smaller machines could use. And I don't remember the exact names of which machines that they were.
Yeah, there was one place I was visiting. They bought a brand new machine, but it's one of those things that we find with handling seaweed. You buy a piece of equipment that's designed for vegetables or for something else, and the salesperson will tell you that it'll work great for seaweed. So when I was there, they were running it, but the technician was also there from the company because it wasn't doing what they said it was doing. So I got to see some troubleshooting in action.
Awesome. And I think this is kind of a follow-up to that question. But doing that blanching process at Atlantic Sea Farm, how much do you see the iodine reduction come down versus the raw product?
I don't have a lot of data on that because we primarily do it for food safety and for the kill step. There is, from looking at the studies from what they do in Scandinavia, I don't have an exact number, but it is a decent amount, but I don't have a number.
It was adequate enough that they were able to then sell the product and meet the regulations in Germany and other EU companies, and that was kind of the solution that everyone seemed to be using. But yeah, like Pete said, it's not something that we've closely tracked.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question who this guest wants to know what equipment or methods are they using on the at-sea processor vessels that might be different than here?
Yeah. Casey, do you want to answer that one or?
Yeah, I can answer one. So we were there, I should say, we visited. He was there in December and I was there in January. So there wasn't a whole lot happening. There was seed in the water, but we didn't get to see really any of that equipment firsthand. But for what they described and what I've seen in some photos that they shared while I was there was like one of them has like a huge processing rig on the back of a boat, and they would bring up, I want to say maybe 5 lines of seaweed at a time, and it's pulled up onto the boat and then all cut off and washed on the boat, and then it would go through a shredder and a blancher, and then be either like frozen or stabilized. So they were doing a lot of that all on the boat with just the scale of being able to pull 5 or even 10 lines in at once. It depended on the layout of the farm.
Yeah, and those are huge. That's like another reason why it's different with, they have huge fishing vessels that they could set that up on the deck.
And then I think others were bringing the kelp to shore. It seemed like there was a lot more processing infrastructure right on the shore. It's not something we dove into or really toured much, but it did seem like there was a lot of access to processing infrastructure on the shore, and they could run it through. One of the companies runs their stuff through some type of other seafood processing plant when they're not, because it's not in use that year.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the scale of the companies compared to Maine? Do they have mom and pop type companies, or is it all considerably larger on a farm by farm basis?
It was a pretty wide spectrum. There was some pretty small, as you say, mom and pop sized facility companies. There are some that are in the, I think 200,000 to 300,000 pounds a year range. And then there there was the company Casey mentioned they're one of the largest salmon producers in the world that are getting into growing seaweed for animal feed. They didn't share I don't think they shared at least what scale they were at, but it sounded like they were a little bit bigger than that.
I think they were maybe up to 400,000 pounds of seaweed a year.
Yeah, that would make
But
sense.
there is some similarities of, I mean, you can grow it, but then you have to stabilize it and process it and sell it so quickly. So a lot of them weren't really sure about the processing seemed to be a bit of a pinch point, and then really the market. There's a huge rush to grow the product and figure out the farming and harvesting technology, but then figuring out exactly how do you stabilize the product and what market you take it to was definitely a bit of an issue. And I don't know, there was less clarity on how folks were doing that. And each company that we met with, not dependent on the size of the company, kind of had a different strategy.
Mhm.
We have a couple more questions about drying specifically, and some of these are a little technical, so you might not know the answer off the top of your head. But one guest was wondering how much of drying throughput is needed for an average farm. Not sure if that's.
I guess you could scale the dryer up to whatever you needed. So, I think most people are trying to dry. You want to get the seaweed dried within a certain time from harvest. So it would just depend on how much you're harvesting. And I looked at some machines that were pretty small. It would do like 1,000 pounds in like 24 hours, and then like the one I saw in Iceland that could do a state of Maine's harvest in like 2 weeks. So yeah, I think it varies on how much you're growing and you want to have dried within a certain amount of time.
Great. Yeah, and then we had another question about the specific temperatures. If it's a rotary dryer, what steam pressure they were using, and if a hot air dryer, what air heat they were using.
I don't know if I have. I definitely don't know the details on steam pressure. And I think on air temperature, it just varied between the technology. I think it's any standard dryer or vegetable dryer you'd see here is anywhere from, I don't know, 160 degrees and up Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I would say that while we found people to be very open and wanting to meet with us and share, there were certain aspects that were more proprietary that they maybe didn't want to share as much information on. So certain details like specific temperatures, I don't think we always were able to learn what people were doing.
So we have a question, with the Japanese industry surviving a lot on farmers doing their own drying, can you financially make it work to create incentives for farmers or third parties to manage the drying step, which would distribute the work and builds capacity to manage larger volumes in tight timeframes?
Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, for sure. I think you can also, I'm not sure if you guys have access to the Q&A, but you can pull them up if it would be easier to read them. But this question starts with the Japanese industry surviving a lot on farmers doing their own drying. Can you financially make it work to create incentives for farmers or third parties to manage the drying step?
I think third parties you could definitely find a way to have a third party do the drying. Yeah,
I can jump in. I mean, I don't much about exactly how folks in Japan do their own drying. There didn't seem to be much influence from that or talk of that on this trip. I think you could make it for third parties to do that drying. I think a lot of it is capital to get started. And then what do you do with your business the rest of the year? Because there is a relatively short, amount of time when seaweed's coming out of the water, particularly here in Maine. And if you're putting in a big capital investment, what is that machinery doing the rest of the year?
Yep.
Awesome. This was an interesting question that I'm also interested in. What were some of the questions you were asked about the kelp industry in Maine during your visit? Do you have any conversations about that?
I mean,
Yeah.
one thing that I found fascinating was folks there really had no clue about the seaweed industry in Maine or even in the US. They were kind of surprised by the amount of seaweed that had been grown in the state of Maine last year, and the markets and the kind of like the CPG products that Atlantic Sea Farms had. They were surprised by how many like retail stores we had gotten into and some of the R&D that had gone into making those kind of unique products and getting them distribution across the US. I don't know if you have something to add on to that, Pete.
Yeah, no, I think definitely that, and then they were asking us a lot about what our challenges were and how what our processes were, and as we shared, a lot of things are similar, but I think Casey talked a lot about the technology and what they the design work and tech work they're doing and trying to automate things and engineer things and harvesting. I think they were surprised at how a lot of the stuff we do is pretty manual, and we're pretty successful with it being manual. So I had a lot of conversations about technology and equipment design and things like that. And then also just the regular day-to-day challenges of processing seaweed.
Thanks for that. So actually, that's a good lead into our next couple questions about equipment. So one of our questions here is, was the equipment being installed on the rented vessel a standard solution, or was it a custom development by the farms for specific vessels that they rented?
I'd say it was largely custom done for this. I don't know if it was for the specific vessels they rented. I would assume that they would be trying to use the same vessels year over year. But a lot of that was being guided by the farm and their farm setup and exactly what type of processing equipment they wanted to run it through and how.
Yeah.
Great. And then another question about equipment actually was wondering if there was shared use equipment or facilities that you saw when you were there, or was it primarily seaweed specific? So you mentioned that there was some salmon crossover with the companies, but was there stuff that the equipment was also crossing over?
There was some situations where people were sharing the space and equipment for different processing facilities that were in their off season during the seaweed harvest. But there was one, I think it's someone that Casey talked to, and I didn't get to meet with on my trip, but there was somebody that was trying to set up a facility to process seaweed for other people. So to process their own harvest and their own seaweed, and then also do it for the other farms and processors and growers in Norway.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question is kind of going back towards power consumption, and one person is wondering that they've said they found that the cost of raw material throughput and recovery are the most significant cost variables, more so than power consumption, and they were wondering if you found the same over in Scandinavia.
I mean, what I saw was everyone almost at in a point of fear was just really talking about the cost of power, and I think a lot of that had to do with the war in Ukraine being so close by and affecting energy costs over there. So yeah, the only thing I heard and talked about was really about the cost of power. I don't know if Casey, you had any other conversations.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I don't really recall anyone talking about the cost of the raw material. I think a lot of these folks are growing it themselves and then processing it themselves. And so that cost is not maybe as called out versus someone like Atlantic Sea Farms who's working with farmers to grow it and then we're buying it. So we're more seeing the cost of the raw material. But that didn't really come up to them with them. I think also a lot of them are really in a pretty early stage where they're growing a 10th or a 5th of what they want to be growing in a couple years. And so they're seeing this as a real time where they're scaling up and learning. And so there's less attention, their costs for their raw materials are higher right now, but it's because they don't have the efficiencies of scale that they're planning for.
Okay.
Did you learn much about, I know this wasn't the reason for going, but were farms doing strain selection? Is it any farther ahead than where we're at?
There was strain selection happening. I don't know. That's one of the things I think they wouldn't share a lot about. They wouldn't, so I don't know where they were in their process of strain selection. I know the one company that's the salmon farming company. One of their goals is to have a proprietary strain of kelp. So, I don't. But that's all he mentioned to me. But I didn't. I don't know how far along any of them are, but I know they're doing it.
It seemed like a lot of the strain selection was coming out of the Netherlands. A lot of people were working with a company, and I'm totally blanking on the name of it, out of the Netherlands that was doing a lot of the strain selection for each of these companies, but they seem to be in a pretty similar stage to where people are in the States. I mean, I think that your question there points though to the fact that we went to look at processing and drying, but there's so much more to learn and so much more to compare, and a lot of the similarities and differences, but there's a lot to learn from what's happening over there. And I think especially at our company, we just weren't aware of what they were doing. So that part of it was really exciting, just to make those connections and see all the research and development that's being put into this.
Awesome. Yes, we have a couple more questions that are related to about wild harvest versus farmed. So one guest would like to know what the scale is of the seaweed industry in Iceland, and is most of the product there being produced wild harvested or farmed? And a similar question about the seaweed fishery in Norway, if it's mostly farmed or if it's a wild harvest.
I know in Iceland, it's definitely primarily wild harvest. Their wild harvest seaweed industry there is much larger than, it's pretty big. They have a lot of wild seaweed and a lot of access to wild seaweed beds. And then in Norway, I don't know what the comparison is. I think because our trip was primarily based around, we ended up primarily meeting with people that are growing it on lines. I didn't get a sense of the wild harvest. I don't know if you did, Casey.
I don't even think the subject came up when I was there.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Maybe that's the answer right there, but I don't think I talked about it.
Yeah.
A question.
Go for
ahead.
Go for it, Maya.
We had a question come up about kind of more of the product and marketing side. So this person's wondering if there's any learnings or inspirations from the ready-made products you saw in Scandinavia, and also if people are more or less accustomed to eating kelp in Europe, or if they eat it in different ways.
I think my experience was similar to the US. They're working on trying to introduce it to people's diets. I know one of the companies I talked to, they sell their seaweed to a company that uses it as an ingredient, and that company doesn't call it out on their packaging. If you search to the ingredient list, you can find kelp in there, but it's not, most things I see here and other places will advertise that there's seaweed in it. But I saw some of the ingredient companies using seaweed in Norway and not calling it out on the packaging. But so I think there's some similar challenges with getting it into the diets and the everyday eating habits of people in Norway. But they're all also pretty excited about it as an economic growth opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think that they're probably less accustomed. There's a number of people that talked to me about how they were grilling us on how do you get Atlantic Sea Farms products with like distribution and into all these stores, and how do you come up with your retail line of products? And that's a different, a lot of that's a different side of our business that I wasn't able to speak to as in depth, but I think that they were actually looking more to the States on how we've done some of that stuff here, and taking that as inspiration for where they could go in some of their product development, and also just the breadth of distribution.
Was there anyone using freeze drying techniques?
Not that I saw. No. I don't know if you talked to them.
No, I don't think so. I think cost of energy probably would have canceled that one out pretty quickly.
We have another question. Can you expand on hybrid solar and mechanized approaches and how people were capturing waste heat for greenhouse drying?
Yeah, I think the hybrid solar and mechanized drying, and it's something that the company I was talking to in particular was still debating whether or not it was worth it, because the solar drying was pretty labor intensive, but trying to do a pre-drying step to get the moisture content down to a lower level, so the mechanical, you'd pay less energy and when you put it into like a rotary drum dryer or a hot air dryer or something like that. But it was pretty standard, like hoop houses that you would string the seaweed up in and to air dry in the sun with fans. And it sounds like a great idea, but it turned out to be pretty labor intensive for them. So yeah, like they weren't sure yet if that made sense for them to do. And then for the recycling, the recapturing heat to use for drying, that's another, I didn't get a lot of information on that. It was they talked about capturing heat from other industries in the area, but I didn't get a lot of data on or information on that.
I think the only thing that I heard on that was just there's some huge data centers with a ton of computers, and they're cooling those down. There's a lot of heat that's coming off of those machines. And so someone was exploring, or someone had started to dry, I don't recall, capturing that waste heat by essentially building some type of drying technology right next to that building or connect to that building, so you could pump the waste heat in and dry seaweed off of that.
Another follow-up question about freeze drying versus blast drying. Someone is wondering what the difference is. Sorry, blast freezing, not blast drying.
Oh, blast freezing. Yeah, that's fine. Blast freezing is just, blast freezer will be like -25 or colder with a lot of fast moving air to quickly freeze something. So you either want to freeze packaged seaweed or finished product, and it's better for food safety reasons to get it down below freezing all the way through the center of the product as fast as possible. So blast freezers do that. They're really efficient, fast moving, super cold air. Freeze drying, I'm not like, I can't explain the details of freeze drying very well, but it's a process of producing a dried product through freezing. I think something in the freezing process in the equipment will remove the moisture through freezing. But one's a drying process and one is like a cold storage process.
So going back to thinking about kind of the public incentives that are kind of really prevalent in the EU, you said there was kind of like a lot of money to work with there. Do you guys, can you think of like, are there any public or private partnerships in the seaweed industry in the EU that you see as models for the way that the industry could be supported in the US?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think in Norway, especially the Norwegian government provides a lot of money and incentive to seaweed producers. I don't know the details. Maybe Casey learned more about it than I did about where or how the grant money comes from through the EU for seaweed producing. But I know definitely in Norway, they provide a lot of funding for economic development to seaweed growers. And yeah, it'd be great to have that here as well. They get quite a bit of money, and it would be, Casey and I sometimes dream about what we would do if we had a $7 million grant to to figure out some of our solutions. But
yeah, I think it kind of came up, but nobody went into too much detail about it.
Yeah.
But it did seem pretty prevalent. A lot of the different companies were able to kind of tap into those resources. One thing that I found particularly interesting, though, was the breadth of where that money was being distributed. So Sir Putis has EU money to do a lot of their design of equipment. And so they're able to get that funded from the EU. And so it's not just the seaweed specific companies, but even like an equipment manufacturer is getting grant money to try to help each of these companies kind of individually create custom equipment for the seeding, the harvesting, the processing of their seaweed. So that's particularly fascinating. It would be incredible to see companies here in the States with funding to work on developing seaweed specific processing technology, because I think right now we're really stuck trying to just kind of retrofit or copy technology or equipment that's used for other industries.
And this might have been a question that you guys, we have a lot of questions, which is awesome. But
That's
this
great.
might be something that you mentioned earlier, but what are the primary species being cultivated in Scandinavia?
I think it's what I primarily saw was sugar kelp. Yeah,
I'd say that was pretty much the only one for a large majority.
And do they use the same method of seeding or starting for the season that we use here? Or is it a different process? I think you might have also mentioned this in the beginning of your presentation.
pretty similar. There are people, yes, pretty similar to get the spores to release and then attach to twine. They use spools and twine. In the conversation of technology and engineering and possibly over engineering, they've been working on machines that'll wrap seed twine around the long line, machines that'll direct seed to the long line rather than using a twine and a spool. And there's mixed results on that, but primarily people are using what I saw anyways was spools and twine.
It did seem like there's a lot of interest in starting to do more direct seeding over there, largely because of the scale that they're trying to do this at. And so they need to be able to seed out their farms a lot faster, and that's one way that they could do it faster. But they were also running into some troubles, I think, as well with the direct seeding. But my guess is in the next couple of years, there'll be a much higher percentage of direct seeding over there.
Awesome. I'm going to do a couple more questions before we wrap up because we're getting kind of close to 1 and I don't want to keep anybody. But we have a couple questions geared towards farming. How are they cutting the kelp off of the line? Is that just
No, I think that's one where it was a mix and I saw some people that had some companies that were using equipment where the line would come up and they had a machine that would cut the kelp off. I think a few people were using knives in the sort of the traditional way, but yeah, I don't know. Casey, you have something to add?
No, I don't think so. I think that was kind of it. I would say they're shifting more towards a mechanical cutting system.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. We still have a few that we didn't get to, but I'm sure that you could probably reach out to Peter or Casey and they'd be happy to maybe chat about this more. I just wanted to bring up before we left off that our next MAIC webinar is going to be on let's see, May 19th, the Friday, same time, and it's actually going to be our own MAIC's own Emily Whitmore will be presenting on farmer strategies and perspectives for social license for shellfish and seaweed aquaculture in Maine. So we'll hear her talk then. Just wanted to thank our panelists one more time. Thank you so much, Peter and Casey, for coming on and chatting with us. Sound like a really cool trip. Love to get out to Scandinavia someday and see this for myself, as I'm sure we all agree. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.